After saving a Puma Cub, a man is surrounded by the pride, and what they do is shocking. After rescuing a Puma Cub from a furious river, Ethan Reyes faced the most unexpected encounter of his life. The current roared around his torso, churning with sediment and debris torn from the Andean slopes. His muscles screamed as he clutched the trembling body of the young mountain lion to his chest. The cub, no older than 5 months, dug its claws into his shoulder, too exhausted to cry out anymore. Patagonia was never forgiving, but today it seemed almost sentient in its cruelty. The morning had started like any other in his 3-week expedition. Ethan had risen before dawn, checking his weather instruments and reviewing his shooting schedule. The forecast had called for light rain, nothing that would interfere with his documentation of the region's wildlife corridors. He had spent months planning this trip, coordinating with local park services and securing permits that would allow him unprecedented access to some of South America's most pristine wilderness. Ethan had spent over a decade in the wilderness. A conservation biologist by training, a wildlife documentarian by trade, he had seen nature at its most brutal and its most sublime. From the Amazon's emerald depths to the harsh beauty of the Atacama Desert, he had witnessed the delicate balance that governed life in the wild. His work had taken him to 6 continents, but Patagonia held a special place in his heart. There was something about this land that felt primordial, untouched by the compromises that civilization demanded elsewhere. But nothing prepared him for this moment. Only minutes earlier, he had been calibrating his lens for a wide shot of the valley when a frantic yowl shattered the morning silence. The sound was desperate, terrified, unlike anything he had heard in years of field recording. By the time he looked up, scanning the landscape with trained eyes, the cub had already slipped into the torrent. The sight stopped his heart. A small, tawny form tumbling in the white water, appearing and disappearing between the foam and debris. For a split second, his scientific training kicked in. Document, observe, record. But then something deeper, more primal, overrode years of academic conditioning. He had dropped everything, gear worth thousands of dollars, protocol that had kept him safe in countless dangerous situations, decades of academic conditioning that told him to observe, not intervene. He ran. The river had swelled overnight from what locals called a river demon, sudden floods that could transform peaceful streams into deadly torrents within hours. Heavy rains, miles upstream in the high Andes, had transformed a lazy trickle into a violent force of nature. Ancient trees, their roots carved deep into the riverbank over centuries, cracked under its surge like matchsticks. Stones once rooted for millennia now tumbled like pebbles in a child's game. And somewhere amid that chaos, a life was being lost. The water temperature was probably just above freezing, fed by glacial runoff from peaks that never saw summer warmth. Ethan knew the dangers. Hypothermia could set in within minutes, and the current was strong enough to dash a grown man against the rocks. But he didn't hesitate. When Ethan plunged in, the cold hit him like a physical blow. His breath vanished, stolen by the shock of icy water flooding his nervous system. The current immediately snatched his legs, trying to sweep him downstream toward a series of rapids that would mean certain death for both him and the cub. But he pushed forward, toward the fragile form spinning in the eddies like an autumn leaf caught in a storm. Reaching the cub was a battle against forces that seemed determined to claim them both. Sharp debris sliced into his thigh, drawing blood that was immediately washed away by the churning water. A massive log, probably torn from some distant mountainside, struck his ribs with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. He nearly went under, his vision darkening at the edges as his body struggled to process the shock and cold. But a desperate instinct took over, one not born of science or training, but of something older, more fundamental, the same drive that had compelled early humans to protect their young, to risk everything for the continuation of life. He seized the cub with one arm, cradling it against his chest, and turned back towards shore. The return journey was worse than the rescue itself. He could barely feel his limbs now, numbness creeping up from his extremities as his core temperature dropped. Every stroke toward shore felt like swimming through concrete. The current fought him at every turn, and twice he thought he would lose his grip on the small, shivering body pressed against him. But the cub's heartbeat became his anchor. He could feel it hammering wildly against his own chest. Rapid, desperate, but alive. That rhythm became Ethan's compass, his metronome, the steady beat that guided him forward when his vision blurred and his strength began to fail. Then he looked up and froze. 5 pumas stood on the riverbank, adults, massive, silent as shadows. Their eyes blazed golden in the morning light, unblinking, fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Bunji, clearly the matriarch, bore a jagged scar down her snout, probably from some long-ago territorial battle, and held herself with the quiet authority that only comes from years of surviving in the wild. Ethan's scientific mind immediately began cataloguing details, even as his survival instincts screamed warnings. The matriarch was probably 8 to 9 feet long, weighing close to 180 pounds of pure muscle and predatory efficiency. The others ranged from slightly smaller females to a massive male whose shoulders rippled with power. In the wild, pumas were typically solitary creatures, coming together only to mate. Seeing 5 together was unprecedented in his experience, but what struck him most was their stillness. They weren't crouched in hunting postures or displaying the tense readiness he would expect from predators encountering a potential threat. Instead, they simply watched, waited. Retreat was impossible. The current would sweep him downstream if he tried to turn back, and he was already hypothermic, his coordination beginning to fail. He stood waist-deep in freezing water, clutching their kin, with no escape route and no backup plan. There were no options left, but they didn't pounce. The matriarch stepped forward, her massive paws finding purchase on the muddy bank with the fluid grace that made these cats such perfect predators. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, not the explosive charge he expected, but something else entirely. She watched him, with eyes that seemed to look beyond the surface, beyond the immediate threat he might represent. The cub in his arms whimpered, a small, pitiful sound that seemed to echo across the water. And everything changed. A low, almost mournful chuff emerged from the matriarch's throat. The sound was unlike anything Ethan had heard from a wild cat, not a roar or a growl, but something that spoke of recognition, perhaps even concern. The others remained motionless, but he could feel the shift in the air, like atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. The standoff became something else, not a confrontation, a meeting, drawing on reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed. Ethan began wading forward. Each step was deliberate, careful, his eyes never leaving the matriarch's golden gaze. She matched his pace, moving parallel to his path along the shore, never breaking eye contact. It was as if they were engaged in some ancient dance, each step choreographed by instincts that predated human civilization. When Ethan finally reached the shallows, his legs nearly buckled. The combination of cold, exhaustion, and adrenaline had pushed his body beyond its limits. He fell to his knees in the muddy shallows and gently lowered the cub to the soft earth. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the world stood perfectly still. Then the matriarch moved. Ethan flinched instinctively, every muscle tensing for impact. But she flowed past him like water, reaching the cub with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Her massive head lowered, and she began nuzzling the small form, her rough tongue working over its soaked fur with the practiced efficiency of a mother who had done this countless times before. Deep, resonant purrs emerged from her chest, sounds of relief, joy, and profound maternal love. The other pumas joined the reunion, but their approach was different from what Ethan might have expected from wild predators. They moved with reverence, forming a protective circle around the cub and its mother, yet remarkably, none of them showed aggression toward him. Instead, they seemed to navigate around his presence like water flowing around a stone, acknowledging him without treating him as a threat. Ethan remained motionless, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever spell had fallen over this impossible scene. His scientific mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. Everything he knew about puma behavior suggested this encounter should have ended very differently. Then, in a moment that would replay in his memory for the rest of his life, the matriarch turned back to him. She approached slowly, deliberately, until she was close enough that he could see his own reflection in her golden eyes. And then, impossibly, she pressed her forehead to his. The contact was gentle but unmistakable. Her fur was coarse against his skin, and he could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body, but it was her eyes that held him transfixed, ancient, intelligent, and filled with what could only be described as gratitude. One by one, the other pumas approached for their own form of acknowledgement, a light touch of a nose to his knee, the brush of a flank against his shoulder. Even the massive male, who had remained a silent sentinel throughout the encounter, stepped forward to give a slow, solemn nudge to Ethan's other shoulder. Each gesture felt ceremonial, purposeful, an initiation into something he couldn't fully comprehend. And then something even more extraordinary happened. An escort formed. Two of the cats flanked him as he struggled to his feet. Others positioned themselves ahead and behind. The cub, now recovered enough to walk, trotted at his side with unsteady but determined steps. Together, they began moving toward his abandoned equipment. The procession was slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic in its formality. Ethan, still dripping and shivering, found himself walking at the heart of a wild honor guard. The feeling was indescribable. Terror had transformed into something approaching reverence. He was not prey in their eyes. He was not an intruder in their domain. He was something else entirely. A guest, perhaps even family. At his tripod, the procession stopped. His expensive cameras and lenses lay scattered where he had dropped them in his rush to reach the river. The matriarch stepped forward one final time, studying him with those penetrating golden eyes, then slowly bowed her magnificent head. Without thinking, Ethan found himself returning the gesture, a bow of respect between species, between souls that had touched across the vast divide that typically separated human and wild. With that final exchange, the pride turned as one and melted back into the forest, disappearing so completely it was as if they had never been there at all. Ethan stood alone for what felt like hours, long after sensation had returned to his extremities and his clothes had begun to dry in the strengthening sun. His mind raced, trying to process what had occurred, but his camera equipment remained untouched. Somehow, documenting the moment felt unnecessary, even inappropriate. Some experiences, he realized, were meant to be felt rather than filmed. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found himself returning to the river daily. He told himself he was continuing his original research, but in truth, he was hoping for another glimpse of the pride that had forever changed his understanding of the natural world. He never expected to see them again. Pumas were notoriously elusive, and such close contact with humans typically drove them deeper into the wilderness. But one dawn, as mist still clung to the valley floor like ghostly fingers, he spotted movement in the distance. The matriarch. She stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably present. She made no sound, no attempt to approach. She simply watched him with those unforgettable golden eyes. Then, with a soft chuff that carried across the still morning air, she turned and vanished back into the forest. She had returned, and somehow Ethan knew this wouldn't be the last time. The encounter had awakened something in him that years of scientific training hadn't prepared him for. He began writing obsessively. Journals, letters, articles, anything that might help him process the profound shift in his worldview. His colleagues, when he finally shared his experience, called it a psychological response to trauma. Some suggested he had suffered mild hypothermia-induced hallucinations, but Ethan knew better. He remembered stories told to him by local elders during previous expeditions. Ancient myths spoke of great cats who watched over their territory like gods, guardian spirits who could judge the hearts of men and find them worthy or wanting. Ethan had always filed such stories under folklore, interesting cultural artifacts, but hardly scientific fact. Until now. The footage from his stationary cameras, which had continued recording throughout the encounter, created a sensation when he finally decided to share it. During a lecture at the University of Buenos Aires, he presented the material to a packed auditorium of skeptical academics. The reaction was explosive. Some scholars dismissed it as fabricated, claiming the behavior was too extraordinary to be genuine. Others were simply baffled, unable to fit what they saw into existing models of feline behavior. A few dismissed it as projection, humans reading emotions and intentions into animal actions that were purely instinctual. But a significant minority saw what Ethan had experienced firsthand. Dr. Isabella Cruces, a leading ethologist specializing in predator cognition, called it the single most compelling instance of non-human social cognition ever captured on film. The footage went viral, spawning documentaries, academic papers, and heated debates about animal consciousness and cross-species communication. Through it all, Ethan remained largely quiet about the publicity. Media attention didn't interest him. What mattered was what he had felt in that moment by the river, the profound connection that had bridged the gap between human and wild. He returned to Patagonia every year after that, drawn by a connection he couldn't fully explain, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, he would find fresh paw prints near his camp, always 5 sets, and once, memorably, 6. The cub was growing. He called it Kintu, meaning gift, in the local Mapuche dialect, a name suggested by an elderly guide who had heard Ethan's story and nodded knowingly. Though they never shared physical contact again, their bond remained, not of biology or domestication, but of choice, of mutual recognition between two beings who had touched something eternal in each other. Years passed, and Ethan's experience by the river continued to resonate far beyond academic circles. He established the Kintu Initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting local conservation efforts throughout Patagonia. The organization trained indigenous rangers, educated youth about wildlife conservation, and spread a simple but powerful message: connection transcends species. The story of the river, the cub, and the pride that chose understanding over instinct began to reshape how people thought about humanity's place in the natural world. Not as masters imposing our will on a conquered landscape, not as detached observers studying subjects through telephoto lenses, but as something humbler and more profound, guests in a world that was never ours to own. One evening, several years after the original encounter, Ethan returned to the same riverbank. He was older now, his beard streaked with grey, his movements a bit slower, but his eyes still bright with wonder. He brought with him a graduate student, Maria, eager and bright-eyed, full of questions about wildlife behavior and conservation philosophy. They camped under the same ancient trees, beside the same rocks, where he had first encountered the pride. As they sat around their small fire, Ethan shared the story once more, watching Maria's expression shift from polite interest to genuine amazement. "Do you think they remember?" she asked, as they prepared to sleep under the southern stars. "I think remembering might not be the right word," Ethan replied. "I think some connections transcend memory. They become part of who we are." Just before sunrise, when the world was suspended in that magical moment between darkness and light, they heard it, a low chuff, soft but unmistakable, then another, answering from a different direction. From the shadows at the forest's edge, 5 shapes emerged, with the fluid grace that had haunted Ethan's dreams for years. Kintu was there, full-grown now, strong and confident, bearing the scars and bearing of a cat who had claimed his place in the wild. He stood just yards away, those golden eyes so like his mother's fixed on the man who had saved his life so long ago. The matriarch was there too, older now but still regal, still radiating that quiet authority that commanded respect from her own kind and others. She watched the reunion with what Ethan could only describe as approval. Then, slowly, Kintu approached. Ethan didn't move, barely dared to breathe. Neither did Maria, who watched wide-eyed as the magnificent cat closed the distance between them. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility and memory. Kintu sat back on his haunches, studying Ethan with the same intensity his mother had shown years earlier. Then, as if some internal debate had been resolved, he stepped forward and gently pressed his massive head against Ethan's shoulder. A gesture passed from mother to son, from son to the human who had risked everything for a stranger's child. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. And Ethan smiled through tears he hadn't realized were falling, because some moments in life don't need explanation or analysis. They don't require peer review or scientific validation. They simply exist, perfect and complete, touching something in us that predates language and transcends understanding. They require only presence, only heart, only the courage to wade into a raging river and trust that the world will meet you with grace. As the sun rose fully above the Andean peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the pride melted back into the forest one final time. But the connection remained, not just between Ethan and the cats who had adopted him into their world, but between all living things who choose recognition over fear, understanding over instinct. In that moment, by a river in Patagonia, the boundaries between human and wild had dissolved completely, and in their place remained something far more powerful, the simple truth that we are all guests in this magnificent, mysterious world, connected by bonds that run deeper than species, stronger than survival, and more enduring than time itself.